The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Sadie Fairchild had buried her real name somewhere beneath the dust of the Arizona territory and was answering to her dead sisters. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Caldwell Creek sat at the edge of the Sonoran Desert like a man too stubborn to move even when the heat pressed down on him with both hands. The town had a livery stable, a general store, a saloon that doubled as a dentist's office on Wednesday mornings, and a newly appointed marshal who was said to be the most decent man west of the Pecos River, which wasn't saying much but meant everything to the people who lived there. His name was Marshal Archer, and he had not asked for a mail order bride. His business partner, a well-meaning but thoroughly meddlesome man named Clem Howitt, had arranged the entire correspondence without telling him until the woman was already 2 days outside of Tucson on the stagecoach. Sadie sat inside that stagecoach with her hands folded in her lap and her heart in 2 separate pieces, and she studied the document in her hands as though reading it again would change what it said. Clara Fairchild, it read. That was the name at the top of the correspondence, the name that had been exchanged in letters for 6 months with a marshal named Archer in a town called Caldwell Creek. That was the name of her younger sister, who had been 20 years old and full of hope, and had written her very best handwriting across those letters, who had planned to step off a stagecoach in Arizona and begin the rest of her life. Clara was dead. She had been dead for 3 weeks, taken by a fever that swept through the boarding house in St. Louis, where they had both lived after their father's farm collapsed under debt and drought. Clara had gone first, and Sadie had sat beside her for 4 days, and when it was over, the grief had settled into her bones like winter cold and refused to leave. There had been nothing left in St. Louis. No family, no work that paid enough to matter, no reason to stay in the place where everything reminded her of a girl who had laughed at every small beautiful thing in the world. And there had been this correspondence, these letters meant for Clara, this arrangement already made. The man in Arizona had written the final letter himself, not through any intermediary, and in it he had expressed a quiet, careful hope that she might find Caldwell Creek to her liking. He had said the desert was not beautiful in the way most people expected, but that once you understood it, you could not imagine living anywhere else. Sadie had read that letter 4 times. Then she had packed her sister's things alongside her own, tucked Clara's name into her chest like a stone she could not put down, and stepped onto the stagecoach with her sister's identity and her own broken heart. She was 24 years old. She was not Clara. She had never expected to be anyone's wife. The stagecoach lurched over a rut in the road, and the woman sitting across from her, a heavy-set merchant's wife named Mrs. Doyle, clicked her tongue sympathetically. "Nearly there," Mrs. Doyle said. "You can see the water tower from the ridge up ahead. Are you excited, dear? First time west of the Mississippi." "Yes," Sadie said, because it was true and because she could not explain the rest of it. "Marshal Archer is a good man," Mrs. Doyle said, settling back against the seat with the authority of someone who had lived in Caldwell Creek for a decade. "Quiet, serious, but fair as they come. He kept the Denton gang from burning down half the town last autumn and didn't fire a single shot, just talked them down. Can you imagine?" Sadie could not quite imagine it, but she filed it away, turning the image in her mind. A man who talked people down instead of shooting them. A man who had written about the desert like it was something he loved rather than simply something he endured. She pressed her face briefly to the window glass and watched Arizona come into view. The town emerged from the desert landscape with the particular honesty of places that made no effort to impress. There was a wide main street packed with pale dust, wooden storefronts casting long afternoon shadows, horses tied at rails outside the general store. Children ran between the buildings, and a woman in a yellow dress stood on the steps of what appeared to be a laundry house, pinning something to a line that stretched between 2 posts. It smelled like dust and livestock, and faintly like the creosote that bloomed after desert rain. Sadie breathed it in and felt something shift in her chest, something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it, like the first breath after a long time holding still. The stagecoach stopped in front of the post office, and the door swung open, and there he was. Marshall Archer was 30 years old, with dark hair that had been recently and somewhat unsuccessfully pressed flat, a marshal's badge catching the late sun on his chest, and an expression that could only be described as carefully composed, the look of a man who was more nervous than he intended to show. He was lean and tall with weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water in October, gray-green and clear, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him, the way a man holds a hat when he is trying to be polite and cannot quite figure out what else to do with himself. Sadie stepped down from the stagecoach, and he looked at her, and something complicated moved through his face before he caught it and put it back where it belonged. "Miss Fairchild," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "I'm glad you arrived safely. I'm Marshall Archer." "I know," she said, and then felt the inadequacy of that and added, "Your letters mentioned the water tower. I recognized it from the ridge." Something in his expression softened marginally. "The letters," he said. "Yes," he paused. "How was the journey from Tucson?" "Long," she said honestly, "but the country is remarkable." He looked slightly startled by this, as though he had not expected it. Then he nodded, and something in the set of his shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. "It is," he agreed. "Most people don't see it that way at first." She reached out and took her own carpetbag from the driver before he could hand it to her, and she saw Marshall Archer notice that small act of independence and say nothing about it, simply reach for the second trunk that had been strapped to the roof. The name sat between them like a splinter she could feel but could not yet reach. Clara Fairchild. She had answered to it all afternoon, through the stop in Tucson, through the introduction to the postmistress, through Mrs. Doyle's cheerful commentary. She would answer to it again now. But she was not Clara, and she knew it with the full weight of her body, and the knowing was its own particular grief. The boarding house where she was to stay until the wedding was run by a woman named Agnes Tillys, who had opinions about everything and coffee that was strong enough to wake the genuinely deceased. Agnes showed Sadie to her room with the efficient warmth of a woman who had done this many times, and handed her a basin of water and a small bar of soap and said, "The marshal takes supper at the Long Table restaurant on Main Street at 6 o'clock most evenings. He said you're welcome to join him tonight if you're not too worn from the road." "Tell him I'll be there," Sadie said, and washed the desert dust from her face and looked at herself in the small tin mirror above the basin. She had Clara's dark eyes, but not Clara's softness. Where Clara had been round and warm and quick to smile, Sadie was sharp-boned and steady, a woman who had spent her whole life being the older one, the careful one, the one who checked to make sure the door was locked before bed. She had been practical when Clara was dreaming, quiet when Clara was laughing, present when Clara was gone. She pressed her palm flat against her own reflection for a moment. Then she put on the cleanest dress she owned and went to have supper with a man who thought she was someone else. The long table was half full when she arrived, a pleasant low-ceilinged room with oil lamps throwing amber light across oilcloth-covered tables. Marshall Archer was already there, seated near the back wall with his back to the corner in the way of a man who had learned never to sit with his back to a door. He rose when she entered, which she had not entirely expected, and pulled out the chair across from him. "How is the room at Agnes's?" he asked once she was seated. "It's fine," she said. "She makes strong coffee." "She does," he agreed, and there was a small shared thing in that, the first of them. "I apologize for Clem," he said then unexpectedly. "My business partner. He arranged this entire situation without my full knowledge, and I want you to know I'm aware that it is not a conventional or comfortable way for anyone to begin. You traveled a very long way on the basis of correspondence with someone you've never met, and I think that deserves more than I know how to offer at a first supper. But I want to try." Sadie looked at him for a moment. This was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared for awkwardness, for politeness stretched thin, for the stiff formality of strangers forced into proximity. She had not prepared for honesty. "That's a thoughtful thing to say," she said. "I'm better in writing than speaking," he said, with a self-awareness that was not false modesty. "Most of what I wanted to say in those letters I said. I meant it. Those letters. Letters written to Clara. Letters that Sadie had read and reread on the train and the stagecoach until she could have recited passages from memory. Letters that had been careful and earnest and surprisingly full of genuine observation. About the town, about the people in it, about the land, about the small things he noticed and thought about. He had written once about watching a hawk circle above the desert for 20 minutes and thinking about patience. He had written about the way the town had changed since the railroad pushed through to Tucson, how some things were better and some things were lost. He had written about his own childhood in Missouri with a quiet brevity that said more in what it left out than what it included. Sadie had read those letters and felt a creeping, terrible guilt, because they were the letters of a man she would have very much liked to know, and she was sitting across from him wearing her dead sister's name. "Tell me about the town," she said, because she needed a moment to breathe before she could look at him directly again. "You wrote that you had been marshal here for 2 years." He talked about Caldwell Creek with the low-key affection of a man who had decided to belong somewhere, and then worked hard enough at it that it was true. He told her about the ranchers to the north and the tension with the smaller farms that fed most of the town directly, about the railroad and what it had changed, about the Apache settlement to the west that most of the town regarded with suspicion born of ignorance and fear, and about his own slow, careful efforts to build something like working relationship between them. He spoke about a family named the Garcias who ran the largest ranch in the valley and whose daughter had recently married one of the Navarro brothers from the Eastern Territory, and about how the town was still arguing about whether that was appropriate. "You disagree with their arguing," she said, reading it in his face. He was quiet for a moment. "I think people spend a great deal of energy deciding who other people are allowed to love," he said, "and it mostly ends badly for everyone involved." She looked at him steadily. "That's an unusual thing for a lawman to say." "Maybe," he said, "but it's what I believe." They ate and she let herself listen to him, and she did not lie about anything she didn't have to, which was harder than it sounded because he asked good questions. He asked what she had done in St. Louis, and she said she had worked in a dressmaker's shop, which was true. She had worked there alongside Clara for 2 years. He asked if she had family there, and she said no, which was also true in the most devastating possible way. He asked if she had ever been anywhere that felt like home, and she was quiet for a moment before she said she wasn't certain she had. "That's something I understand," he said. Then, after a pause, "I hope you'll give this place a chance before you decide." She looked at him across the oil lamp and thought about how Clara had written to her about these letters in the evenings, reading passages aloud from the narrow bed beside her, saying, "Listen to this, Sadie, listen to what he says about the hawk," and laughing not because it was funny but because it was beautiful, because Clara had been the kind of person who laughed at beautiful things. "I intend to," Sadie said. Walking back to Agnes's boarding house after supper, the sky above Caldwell Creek was enormous and scattershot with stars in a way that simply did not happen above a city, and Sadie stopped in the middle of Main Street and looked up at it, and Marshall Archer stopped too, a step behind her. "I know," he said quietly, without being asked. She turned to look at him, and for a moment in the starlight, with the whole desert going dark around them and the sound of someone's guitar drifting out of the saloon, she felt the full weight of what she had done settling onto her shoulders. She felt the shape of the lie she was living. And she felt beneath that something else entirely, something she did not want to name yet and did not have the right to name, not while she was standing there in her dead sister's place. "Good night, Mr. Archer," she said. "Good night, Miss Fairchild," he said, and she flinched at the name so slightly that she was almost certain he did not notice. The following week unfolded with a careful rhythm. Marshall Archer was a busy man by nature and by necessity. the town's law and order being a full-time occupation in a way that the residents of more civilized places could not quite appreciate. Caldwell Creek in 1882 was a place of constant negotiation between cattlemen and farmers, between the growing railroad interests and the old established families, between the law of the territory and the older laws that had existed before any of it, the laws of the land and the people who had lived on it longest. Sadie spent those first days learning the town the way she had always learned new places, methodically and on foot, walking each street until she could picture it with her eyes closed. She introduced herself to the dressmaker, a Spanish-speaking woman named Lucia who ran her shop with extraordinary precision and took one look at Sadie's hands, the calluses at the fingertips, the particular set of her wrists, and said, "You sew?" "I do," Sadie said. "Then come back tomorrow," Lucia said, "and we will talk." She found the post office, the schoolhouse, the church, the livery stable where a man named Pete Dawson ran a fair operation and was clearly the town gossip, though he did not seem to know it about himself. She found the small office that Marshal Archer used as his marshal's headquarters, a modest room with a desk and a locked cabinet, and a rifle mounted on the wall that looked as though it was cleaned regularly. She did not go in, but she noted it. And she found the edge of town, the place where Main Street ran out and became a track that curved south toward the desert proper, where the creosote grew in earnest, and the silence was a physical thing you could lean against. She went there each morning before breakfast, in the cool blue hour before the sun had committed itself, and she stood at the desert's edge and talked to Clara in her head, the way she had been doing since the fever took her. She told Clara she was sorry. She told Clara that he was a good man, which was the truth, more truth than she had expected. She told Clara that the desert was exactly as strange and beautiful as she had somehow known it would be, that the saguaro cactus in the early light looked like something between a person and a prayer. She told Clara she did not know what she was doing. On the fifth day, Marshal Archer found her there. He came around the corner of the last building at the edge of town with his hat in his hand and his coat not yet buttoned, clearly on his way somewhere, and he stopped when he saw her. He said nothing for a moment. She said nothing. The desert was turning gold and the sky was going from pale to blue, and somewhere out in the creosote there was a bird singing. "Do you come here every morning?" he asked finally. "Since I arrived," she said. He came to stand beside her, not close, not intrusively, just beside her, looking out at the same thing. "I used to," he said. "When I first came here, I'd come out here in the early morning and just stand in it." "What changed?" "I got busy," he said, with the dry self-deprecation of someone who was not entirely proud of it. Then, after a pause, "I missed it." They stood in the desert morning together for a few minutes without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence Sadie had experienced since before Clara died, and that scared her more than anything else so far. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." She chose her question carefully, the one she actually needed to ask rather than the one she wanted to ask. "What is it you're hoping for?" she said. "From this arrangement?" "I want to understand what you actually want, not what the letters said in the abstract." He thought about it, which she appreciated. He did not answer immediately or with the easy platitudes a man might use to seem agreeable. He looked at the desert for a while and then he said, "I want someone who sees this place the way I see it. Someone I can talk to honestly and who will talk back honestly. Someone I can trust and who can trust me." He paused. "I know that sounds simple, but I've found that simple things are usually the hardest." The stone that was Clara's name pressed hard against her sternum. "It does sound simple," she said. "And it is the hardest thing." She looked at him sideways. "You'll have it from me," she said, "as much as I'm able." He looked at her, and she saw him hear the careful qualification in that, the "as much as I'm able," and she saw him decide not to press it. He nodded slowly, and she thought that nod was one of the most decent things she had witnessed in some time. Over the following weeks, something grew between them with the particular persistence of desert plants, slowly, deeply, without spectacle, but with an extraordinary amount of root structure for something that looked modest on the surface. He came to the desert edge in the mornings more often than not. She began helping Lucia in the dressmaker's shop 4 mornings a week, and found that the work soothed her the way work always had, her hands moving through the familiar motions of fitting and cutting and stitching, her mind having something to do that was not grief or guilt. The wedding had been tentatively discussed as occurring within the first month of her arrival, but it had not been formally arranged, and as the first month progressed, there seemed to be an unspoken mutual agreement that they were in no hurry. Clem Howitt, who turned out to be a broad-faced, cheerful man with no capacity for social subtlety, mentioned it twice and was twice deflected, once by Marshall and once by Sadie herself, who said, in her clearest, most polite voice, that she thought they might benefit from getting to know each other properly first, and Clem had the decency to look slightly abashed. She learned things about Marshall Archer in the way you learn things about someone when you see them regularly in the ordinary course of living. She saw him mediate a dispute between 2 ranchers whose properties shared a fence line, standing in the dust of Main Street with both men red-faced and furious, and talking them to a point of grudging compromise with such patient, precise logic that the whole thing resolved before anyone reached for anything threatening. She saw him stop in the middle of his own business to help an elderly Apache man named Tajos who had come into town to trade and been refused service at the general store, not with confrontation but with a quiet word to the storekeeper, and then a longer, more private conversation that she was not privy to, but that resulted in the situation being corrected. She saw him sit with a child who had fallen from a horse and was waiting for the doctor, not doing anything particular, just sitting with her so she was not alone, his presence calm and steady and entirely without agenda. She saw him notice things, the way a man's hands moved when he was hiding something, the way a building's roof was beginning to warp on one side and would need attention before autumn, the way the desert light changed in the hour before a rainstorm, the particular color of the clouds coming out of the southwest. He was a man who paid attention to his world with the seriousness of someone who understood that attention was a form of love. Sadie was in considerable trouble, and she knew it. She was falling in love with a man who did not know her real name. She went to the desert edge on a morning near the end of her 4th week in Caldwell Creek, and she stood there for a long time alone, and she talked to Clara more seriously than she had before. She said, "Clara, I am going to have to tell him. I cannot do this, I cannot let this keep going as it is. It is not fair to him and it is not fair to you, and whatever happens after, I cannot build anything real on this particular foundation." She thought she heard Clara say, in the way of sisters who knew each other completely, "Well, it took you long enough to figure that out." She chose the same morning hour. She went to the desert edge and waited, and he came, as he often did now, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee that he had gotten from Agnes's kitchen on his way through, because he had started doing that and neither of them had acknowledged it as the habit it was. He handed her the cup and she held it in both hands and she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her over his own cup and something in her voice made him still, not alarmed exactly but fully present the way he got when something mattered. "All right," he said. She made herself look at him directly. She had decided she owed him that at minimum. "My name is not Clara," she said. "Clara was my sister. She is the one who wrote those letters, who arranged to come here. She died 3 weeks before I arrived, of a fever. And I took her place because I had nothing left where I was and because I did not know what else to do, and I am telling you now because it is the right thing to do and because I cannot continue to answer to a name that belonged to someone I loved." The silence was complete for a moment. The bird in the creosote sang. The sky was going from pale to gold. "What is your name?" he said. She had not expected that to be the first question. "Sadie," she said. "Sadie Fairchild." He was quiet for another moment that felt like a long time but was probably 10 seconds. "How old are you?" he asked. 24, she said. He looked out at the desert. She could see him processing it, the careful, methodical way he processed things. She braced herself for anger or disappointment or the cold withdrawal of a man who felt deceived, all of which would have been entirely reasonable. "Were you afraid to tell me?" he said. The question surprised her. "Yes," she said. "Why today?" She looked at him. "Because it was past time, because you are not a man who deserves to be deceived." Because she stopped. "Because," he said very quietly. "Because I want to know you," she said. "As myself, not as her." He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was complicated and careful and honest in the way that everything about him was, and he said, "Tell me about her." So she did. She stood there in the desert morning with the coffee getting cold in her hands, and she told him about Clara, who had been born with an excess of hope and distributed it freely to everyone around her. She told him about growing up on the farm, the two of them together, how Sadie had always been the practical one, and Clara the dreaming one, and how between them they had made one complete person. She told him about the boarding house in St. Louis and the work and the letters Clara had read aloud in the evenings. She told him about the fever, the 4 days beside her, the way Clara had asked her near the end to take care of things, and how Sadie had not known what she meant until later. She did not cry. She had run out of tears some weeks ago, but her voice went rough in the places it was rough, and she did not try to smooth it. When she was finished, he said, "She wrote those letters with real feeling. I could tell that reading them." "She was full of real feeling," Sadie said, "about everything. I think," he said carefully, "that you have been carrying an enormous amount of weight." "Yes," she said, simply. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not angry, Sadie." The sound of her own name in his mouth after weeks of the wrong name was something she had not anticipated. It hit her like the first breath of cool air after a long hot afternoon. "You're not," she said. "I'm not," he said. "I think I understand why you did what you did, even if I don't know if I would have made the same choice." And I think he stopped, looked back at the desert, then back at her. "I think whoever I've been getting to know these past weeks is you. Not Clara, you. And I would like to keep getting to know you if you're willing." Sadie looked at him for a long moment in the early morning light. She thought about the 11 months since Clara died, the weight she had been carrying, the grief and the guilt, and the particular loneliness of a person who had lost the one person who had known them completely. She thought about this town, this strange, beautiful, dust-colored town at the edge of the desert that she had come to against every rational instinct she possessed. She thought about mornings at the desert edge and coffee in tin cups, and a man who talked to children who were hurt and talked down angry men, and noticed the way the light changed before a storm. "I'm willing," she said. What followed was both simpler and more complicated than what had come before. Simpler because there was nothing to pretend now, no careful management of which parts of herself she could let show, and which she had to keep covered under her sister's name. More complicated because being fully herself meant Marshall Archer was getting all of her. The grief and the stubbornness and the sharp edges and the particular way she saw things. And she was getting all of him, which turned out to include a dry humor she had caught glimpses of but now came forward more consistently, and an occasional irritability when the town's various complications mounted up, and a depth of feeling about justice that was not comfortable or easy, but was entirely real. They argued, the first real argument coming on a morning in late June when Clem Howitt and 2 of the other town council members met with Marshall to discuss the Apache settlement west of town. Word had come that a group of settlers pushing down from the north intended to claim a portion of the land near the water source the settlement depended on, and the council's proposal was to do nothing, on the grounds that it was territorial government business and not local. Sadie heard about this through Lucia, whose family had relationships with several people in the settlement, and she went directly to Marshall's office. She pushed open the door without knocking, which she recognized in some part of herself was not entirely polite but did not stop her, and said, "You need to do something about the Delahunt claim." He looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-thought and is recalibrating. The office was empty except for him. "Good morning, Sadie," he said. "The Delahunt claim," she said again. "Lucia tells me they intend to file by the end of the month. That land includes the spring that the settlement has used for 40 years. I'm aware," he said, and it is territorial government business," he said. The council wants to do nothing," she said. "Is easy because it is not their water, and you know that, so tell me what you actually think." He looked at her for a moment. She could see him deciding whether to be annoyed and choosing not to be, choosing instead to be honest. "I think it's wrong," he said. "I think it has been consistently wrong since long before I arrived here, and that each time it happens we tell ourselves it is someone else's jurisdiction until there is nothing left." "Then say so," she said. "Write to the territorial office yourself. You have standing, you have a badge." "I have a badge that covers this town," he said, "not the territory." "You have a reputation," she said, "as a man who is fair. That covers more ground than a badge." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right." He said it directly, without qualifier. She was slightly taken aback by the immediacy of it, having prepared for more argument. "I know," she said, and then felt slightly embarrassed by that. "I mean, thank you." "You are," he said, "very possibly the least easily managed woman I have ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. "It was meant as one," he said, and she saw the slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth that was his version of a full smile. He wrote to the territorial governor's office that afternoon, a letter that was precise and well-reasoned, and that laid out the prior claim and the harm that would be caused without the language of abstraction or politics, but with the direct plainness of a man describing something he had seen with his own eyes. He sent a copy to a lawyer in Tucson who had taken on cases of this nature before. And he went himself, the following morning, to the Apache settlement to speak with the people there directly, to understand precisely what the situation was and what they needed. Sadie did not go with him on that first visit, understanding that it was not her place to insert herself into something so delicate. But she asked him about it when he returned in the late afternoon, sitting on the steps of Agnes's boarding house in the long golden light. "There are 63 people there," he said. "Families, children. They have been there for 2 generations since the relocation. They farm a portion of the land and the rest they leave as it has always been." He paused. "The elder who spoke with me, a woman named Dotest, she was very clear about what would happen if the spring was diverted. Not angry, just clear." "What did she say?" "She said we would not be the first people to make promises with the land and break them," he said. "She said she had stopped expecting promises and was now only interested in actions." Sadie was quiet for a moment. "That is an entirely reasonable position," she said. "Yes," he said. "I told her I intended to act." She looked at him in the long light. "Do you know," she said, "that when Mrs. Doyle told me on the stagecoach that you were a good man, I thought it was the kind of thing people say about someone they want you to like. I did not expect it to be this specifically true." He looked at her sideways. "I'm not always this specifically good," he said. "I have days of being thoroughly mediocre." "Name one," she challenged. He thought about it with exaggerated seriousness. "Last November," he said, "there was a dispute over a mule. I handled it very poorly." "The mule dispute," she said gravely. "Clem still mentions it," he said, and she laughed. She laughed properly, the way she had not laughed since before Clara died, since before everything, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere warm and real and catches you off guard. It lasted only a moment, but it was entirely genuine, and she felt it in her whole body. And Marshall Archer looked at her while she laughed with an expression that she could not entirely read, but that settled in her memory like something important. That evening after supper, walking back along Main Street in the warm June dark, he stopped in front of the dressmaker's shop and turned to her and said, "Sadie." She turned to look at him. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "I have been trying to be since you told me your name, but I want to be more so now." "All right," she said. "I am not interested in this arrangement as an arrangement," he said. "I was not particularly interested in it as an arrangement from the beginning, which is why I let it go for a month without making plans. What I am interested in is you. Specifically you. The way you talk and the way you see things and the way you push back when something is wrong and the way you stood in the middle of Main Street and looked at the stars on your first night here." He paused. "I am telling you this because I think you deserve to know it, and because I don't want you to make any decision about this town or your life here based on an obligation that isn't real. You are not obligated to anything. Whatever you decide, I want it to be a genuine choice." She looked at him for a long moment in the warm dark. She thought about what a genuine choice meant after the not genuine choices that had brought her here. She thought about the desert edge in the morning and 2 cups of coffee and the sound of her own name in his voice. "I am not here out of obligation," she said carefully. "I have not been for some weeks now." He looked at her steadily. "No, no," she said. And because she was Sadie Fairchild and not Clara and therefore inclined toward directness over subtlety, she said, "I came here wearing someone else's name and my own grief, and somewhere in the past month the grief is still there. It will always be there, but there is something else alongside it now, and it has your face on it." The silence between them was warm rather than empty. He reached out and took her hand, very carefully, the way you take something you want to keep, and she let him. And they stood there on Main Street in the June dark with the stars overhead and the saloon guitar spilling out of the open door and the desert breathing around them in the dark. "I would very much like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission." "You have it," she said. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary 2 months of Sadie Fairchild's life, which was not a competition without strong contestants, but which won decisively. Marshall Archer courting her properly meant supper together most evenings, rides out into the desert on Sunday afternoons when his duties allowed, long conversations about everything and nothing, books passed back and forth with passages marked, his handwriting in the margins, hers responding. It meant meeting more of the townspeople, being introduced not as the Marshalls intended but as herself, Sadie, who worked at Lucia's shop and had particular opinions about the water rights situation, and finding that people responded to her as herself in a way that felt new and necessary. It meant being seen. There was a Sunday ride in July that she would remember for the rest of her life, when they went out into the desert proper, past the last of the town's outlying structures and into the genuine wild of it. The saguaro standing 20 and 30 feet tall in every direction like a silent congregation, the shadow of a hawk crossing the pale ground ahead of them. She had learned to ride adequately if not gracefully in the time she had been in Caldwell Creek, and she rode beside him on a steady-tempered gray horse named Patience, who Sadie privately thought was an excellent horse for many reasons including the name. They stopped on a low rise of ground and looked out at the desert in all directions, and there was nothing else in it but them and the light and the distant dark line of the mountains to the west. "What do you see?" he asked. It was a question he asked sometimes, not rhetorically but genuinely. She thought about it. "I see something that has been here for a very long time," she said, "much longer than us. I see something that will still be here after everything we've built is gone." And I find that she paused, working out what she actually meant. Comforting rather than frightening, because it means whatever we do here matters in the scale of our own lives, and the permanence of the landscape doesn't diminish that, it just puts it in proportion. He was looking at her. She turned and found him looking at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he looked at things he was working to understand completely. "What?" she said. "I have been thinking for some time," he said, "that I love you. I am telling you now because I think you should know it, and because I think the desert is an appropriate place for the truth." Sadie looked at him in the enormous desert afternoon. She felt the words settle into her the way the desert morning settled, slowly and completely. She felt Clara somewhere in the background of it, not as a shadow but as something warmer, an approval, a blessing, the ghost of a girl who had laughed at beautiful things, and this was a beautiful thing. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to tell you for 3 weeks and failing to find the right moment." He said, "This is the right moment." She said, "Yes, it is." He reached across the space between their horses and took her face in one hand, and she leaned into his palm, and he kissed her with the seriousness and gentleness of a man who meant it completely, there in the middle of the Arizona desert with the saguaro standing witness and the hawk turning overhead. Returning to town that afternoon, Sadie felt lighter than she had felt in more than a year. Not because the grief for Clara was gone, it was not and would not be, but because grief and love were both true things and they could exist in the same heart, and the love did not crowd out the grief. It simply gave it better company. Marshall Archer proposed formally on a Tuesday evening in August, in the office of his marshal's headquarters, which was not the most romantic setting, but which she later pointed out was entirely characteristic. He had the ring, a simple thing of silver with a small garnets that had belonged to his mother, and he went down on one knee on the wooden floorboards beside his desk with the complete earnestness of a man who did not do things by half measure, and he said, "Sadie Fairchild, I would like to spend the rest of my life knowing you. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment in the lamplit office. She thought about St. Louis. She thought about the stagecoach and the first sight of the water tower from the ridge. She thought about the desert edge at dawn and 2 cups of coffee and her real name in his voice, and a Sunday in the desert with the hawk turning overhead. "Yes," she said, with her whole heart. The wedding was in September, when the worst of the summer heat had broken, and the desert smelled of the rain that had come through the week before, clean and sharp and clear. Lucia made her dress, cream-colored cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar and cuffs, and Agnes Tillys cried openly through the entire ceremony, and Clem Howitt was so pleased with himself that everyone largely forgave him for his original meddling, and the church was full with people who had come to know Sadie as herself over the preceding months. Tajos, the elder from the Apache settlement, came into town for the occasion with 3 other members of the settlement, which was notable, and which Marshall had not arranged, and therefore meant a great deal to him. Tajos said, in the careful English she had learned over decades of necessity, that she was glad to see the Marshal marry a woman with sense in her eyes, and Sadie thanked her and meant it fully. The letter from the territorial governor's office had arrived in August, 2 weeks after Marshall's formal proposal, with a determination that the Delahunt claim was being denied pending review of prior use and settlement rights, which was not a permanent solution, but was a significant one, and the lawyer in Tucson had written to say he intended to pursue the full designation. There was still work to be done. There would always be work to be done. But the spring would run this year, and the families in the settlement would have their water. The ceremony was simple, the words traditional, and when the preacher asked her to take Marshall Archer as her husband, she looked at him across the small space between them, at his careful, honest face and his creekwater eyes, at the man who had gone down on one knee in his own office and asked to spend his life knowing her, and she said, "I do," with a clarity she had not known she possessed. He said the same words back to her with a quiet intensity that was entirely his, and she felt them land in her chest like something that had been waiting for a place to be. After the ceremony, the town had arranged a small celebration in the street outside the church, with tables brought out from the saloon and the long table restaurant combined, and someone had strung lanterns between the buildings. And there was music from a 3-piece band that had come from Tucson for the occasion, and which played with more enthusiasm than precision, but made up for the latter with the former. Sadie danced, which she had not done since she was 17 and her father had held the last summer dance on the farm before the debts began, and Marshall danced with her with the focused concentration of a man who had not danced recently but intended to do this correctly. "You are thinking very hard about your feet," she observed. "I'm thinking very hard about your feet," he said, "specifically about not stepping on them." "I appreciate that consideration," she said. Clem Howitt danced with Agnes Tillys and managed to knock over one of the lantern poles, which was caught before it became catastrophic, and Lucia danced with her husband Enrique, and several of the ranchers and their families who had come into town for the occasion provided a ring of cheerful noise around the whole affair. and the stars came out overhead in the way they always did over Caldwell Creek, enormous and deliberate, as though the desert had arranged them specifically for this. Marshall pulled her slightly apart from the crowd at one point in the evening, not far but enough for a private moment, and he said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "On the first evening," he said, "when you stepped off the stagecoach, I looked at you and I thought something is careful here, not closed but careful, like someone who has had to be very precise about what they show." He paused. "I didn't know then what I know now, but I thought, whoever she is underneath the careful, I want to know that person." Sadie looked at him in the lantern light. She thought about all the careful she had carried, the careful of growing up as the practical one, the careful of managing grief, the careful of wearing someone else's name. She thought about how it had felt these past months to put down the careful, layer by layer, in the presence of a man who waited patiently for what was underneath. "You know her now," she said. "I know her now," he agreed, "and she is the most remarkable person I have met." She kissed him, there in the edge of the lamplight with the desert dark beyond the town and the music playing and the sounds of the people they had both come to love around them. She kissed him, and she felt the full present weight of the life they were stepping into, the real specific beautiful difficult life, in this town, in this desert, with this man. They spent their first night as a married couple in the small house on the north side of Main Street that Marshall had been living in alone for 2 years, and which Sadie had already been quietly and strategically improving for the past month, adding curtains at the windows, a proper rug on the sitting room floor, a second chair on the porch facing west so they could watch the desert evenings together. He noticed the additions when they walked in for the first time as a married couple and said nothing, simply stood in the sitting room and looked at what she had made of it, and his silence was full rather than empty. "Do you mind?" she said. "I have never liked this house more than I do right now," he said. The following morning they were both up before dawn out of habit, and they went together to the desert edge as the sky lightened, standing in the cool of the early morning with the creosote and the saguaro and the hawk somewhere above in the dark turning toward gold. She said, "Good morning, Mrs. Archer," to herself, quietly, testing the sound of it. He heard her because he was paying attention as he always was, and he looked at her sidelong with the slight upward movement at the corner of his mouth. "How does it sound?" he said. "True," she said. The life they built together in Caldwell Creek was ordinary in the ways that good lives are ordinary, full of the everyday details of a town and a household, and the constant ongoing work of being two people who chose each other and kept choosing. It was also, in the ways that mattered, extraordinary. Sadie took on more work with Lucia, and eventually, in the spring following the wedding, became her partner in the dressmaking business, which they expanded to include alterations and commission work, taking orders from as far as Tucson. The shop became one of the places in Caldwell Creek where women gathered and talked, and where information moved through the town with particular efficiency. And Sadie developed a reputation as a woman who could be trusted with a confidence, and who gave advice that was direct and useful rather than simply comforting. She was not everyone's favorite person, because directness in a woman in 1882 was not universally appreciated, but she was deeply trusted by the people who mattered to her, and she found that was enough. Marshall continued the slow, careful work of making Caldwell Creek a more just place, not through dramatic gestures, but through the accumulated weight of consistent, decent action, the way a river carves stone, not all at once but over time and without stopping. The territorial designation for the settlement's land came through in the fall of 1883, a legal protection that was not perfectly secure, but was significantly more than had existed before, and the elder Tahos came into town specifically to tell Marshall and Sadie that the settlement would remember this. She said it in a way that meant something much larger than the words, and both of them understood that. Clem Howitt eventually admitted that, while his methods had been entirely inappropriate, He was thoroughly pleased with the outcome, and Marshall told him that he would never be forgiven for going about it the way he had, but was forced to admit the results spoke for themselves. And Clem laughed his enormous laugh and bought drinks at the saloon for everyone in earshot. In the winter of 1883, Sadie discovered she was expecting a child. She told Marshall on a Sunday morning in December, sitting at the kitchen table before the fire with coffee and the good cups they had been given as a wedding present, because some news needed the good cups. She said it plainly in the way she said most things, and she watched his face move through surprise into something she had no word for, a kind of stunned and complete joy that he usually kept more contained than this, a joy that was too large for containment. He set down his cup. He looked at her. He said, "Sadie." "Yes," she said. "Spring, I think." He got up from his chair and came around the table and pulled her into his arms the way she had long since learned he did when feeling was bigger than words, holding her carefully as though she were both sturdy and precious, which she found entirely appropriate as a summary of how she thought of herself. "Are you frightened?" He asked into her hair. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Terribly," he said. "Entirely and very happy." "Good," she said. Same. She thought of Clara. She thought of the sister who had been so full of hope, who had never had the chance to come to this desert and see how the saguaro looked at dawn, who had never had the chance to love or be loved the way Sadie had found herself loved. She thought of how Clara would have been absolutely thrilled about a baby, would have been impossible to live with in her excitement, would have had opinions about names, and already purchased something ridiculous and impractical and wonderful. She felt the grief and the love together, as she had learned to feel them, and she said to Clara in her heart, in the way she still talked to her, "I am not done carrying you, but I am carrying you forward now." The pregnancy was not easy in all respects, the summer heat in particular being a challenge that required Lucia to take over most of the physical work of the shop for 2 months, while Sadie managed the business side, which she did sitting in the relative cool of the back room with a fan and a glass of cold water, and a degree of creative swearing that she tried to keep below Agnes Tillys's hearing range. Marshall was attentive without being smothering, which was the right balance, bringing her cool water and asking how she was feeling and generally being present in the precise calibration that she needed, not more, not less. Their son was born on an April morning in 1884, delivered by the town's doctor with Lucia and Agnes in attendance, a long and difficult and ultimately successful process that Sadie endured with the characteristic Fairchild stubbornness that had gotten her onto a stagecoach to Arizona in the first place. Marshall was in the sitting room for the duration, and she was told afterward that he had worn a path in the rug, and had drunk enough coffee to supply a small army but had been entirely calm in appearance, the way he was entirely calm in appearance when he was most frightened, which she knew now as well as she knew her own face. When they put the baby in her arms, she looked at the small, red-faced, furious face of her son, and the love that came was the size of the desert, enormous and specific and entirely without qualification. Marshall came in when Agnes called him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Sadie with the baby, and she saw his face do the thing it did when he was feeling something too large for words, the complete stillness that was not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of everything being present at once. He came to sit beside her and put his hand very carefully against the baby's head, his large, sun-dark hand against the downy crown of his son's head, and he said nothing for a long moment. "Hello," he said finally to the baby. "I'm your father. I intend to do that properly." Sadie looked at him with her whole heart entirely visible on her face, which she would not have permitted 3 years ago and now permitted freely, because being known was not the danger she had once believed it to be. It was, in fact, the thing that made everything else possible. They named him Jacob Fairchild Archer, Jacob for Marshall's father and Fairchild because Sadie had asked if she could keep her own name in it somewhere, and he had said, without hesitation, that he would not have it any other way. The years that followed were full. The dressmaking business grew, and Sadie hired 2 additional women to help. One of them, a young woman recently arrived from Mexico named Rosa, who could sew faster than anyone Sadie had ever seen, and who had opinions about color that Sadie found genuinely educational. The shop became something she was proud of in the specific way of something built carefully over time. Marshall became one of the most respected law officers in the Arizona Territory, not through the kind of fame that accompanied drama or violence, but through the accumulated reputation of consistent fair dealing. And when the county eventually reorganized its law enforcement structure in 1886, he was offered a position that would have required moving to Tucson, a position of more authority and more money, and he turned it down. He told her before he refused it, laying the offer before her at the kitchen table with the same directness he brought to everything, and said, "I want to know what you think." She had looked at the offer and then at him and said, "What do you want?" "I want to stay here," he said. "This is my town, but I want to know if you want more than this." She had looked around at their kitchen, at the house that had become deeply theirs over the years, at the view from the back window that showed the desert edge and the place where she still went in the mornings, at the town through the window that she knew street by street and person by person now. She thought about what more meant. "I have more than I knew how to want," she said. "Stay." He wrote back, declining the offer the following morning. Jacob grew into a boy with his father's eyes and his mother's sharp tongue, which was a combination that the town regarded with affectionate caution, and by the time he was 4, he had the run of most of Main Street in the way of a child who was known by everyone and monitored by all. He was serious, and then suddenly wild, quiet and then unbearably loud, and Sadie adored him with a ferocity that surprised her even after 4 years of being his mother. When Jacob was 3, there was an afternoon in late summer when Sadie found herself at the desert edge, the familiar place, standing in the gold afternoon light with the saguaro watching over everything the way they always did, and she felt Clara so clearly that she had to stop and breathe. She said, out loud this time quietly to the desert, "He is so good, Clara. You would have loved him enormously. You would have been the best aunt." She stood there for a while, letting the grief be real and whole, because it was still real and still whole, and then she walked back into town to where Marshall was sitting on the porch steps with Jacob asleep against his side, the boy's dark head heavy on his father's arm, and the evening light making everything golden and specific. He looked up when she came through the gate. "All right," he said, reading her face the way he had learned to read her face over these years. "Yes," she said. "I was talking to Clara." He nodded, as he always did, because he had understood for a long time that Clara was part of what she carried and always would be, and he had never asked her to put it down. "What did you tell her?" Sadie came and sat beside him on the steps, careful not to disturb Jacob, and leaned her head against Marshall's shoulder. "I told her you were good," she said. "She knew it before I did, I think. She would have told you in those letters if she'd had more time." He put his arm around her, his hand warm on her arm. "I'm glad it was you who came," he said. "I am glad every day of my life that it was you who stepped off that stagecoach." She looked out at Main Street in the evening light, at the town that had been Clara's destination and had become her own life. She thought about the telegram incident. Louis, the decision made in grief and desperation, the name she had borrowed and then returned, the woman she had arrived as, and the woman she had become, not different essentially but more fully herself than she had ever been, in the particular way of someone who has been fully known. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere wearing someone else's name, what it meant to keep the secret and then give it up, what it meant to be loved not for the name but for the person underneath it, the actual irreducible specific person, Sadie Fairchild, who had been practical when her sister was dreaming and had turned out to need the dreaming after all, and had found it in the most unexpected landscape on earth. "I am glad too," she said, "every day." Jacob stirred in his sleep and made a sound that might have been a word or might have been nothing, and Marshall tightened his arm around him without waking him, the unconscious competence of a father who has been doing this long enough that it is written into his body. The following spring brought a second pregnancy, and the spring after that brought a daughter. They named her Clara. Not without thought, not without the long conversation at the kitchen table with the good cups and the desert dark outside and their son already asleep in his room. Sadie had said the name out loud and then sat with it for a moment, and Marshall had asked her, very gently, if she was certain. She should have a name in this world, Sadie said. She should have something. I cannot give her back or give her the life she would have had, but I can give her this. Then Clara she is, he said. The girl born in April of 1887 was loud and opinionated, and seemingly born already knowing what she wanted, which was constant motion and attention, and the sound of her brother's voice, and she had Sadie's dark eyes and her father's steady look, and she was named for a girl who had laughed at beautiful things. Sadie held her daughter on the first night and said, in her heart, in the familiar internal conversation that had been her way of keeping Clara present all these years, "This is for you. This is the most I could do." She felt, in the way of things that cannot be explained but are no less real for that, something warm and certain in response. Not grief this time, not the cold stone of it, but something lighter, something that felt like Clara's laugh. By the time Caldwell Creek moved into the 1890s, the town had grown and changed in ways that Sadie and Marshall had partly shaped and partly simply watched, the way you watch a river, knowing it will do what rivers do, but finding the doing of it interesting nonetheless. The railroad had brought more settlers and more commerce and more complexity. The Apache settlement to the west had gained its formal land protection through a process that the Tucson lawyer had pursued for years and finally achieved. And while the larger injustices of the territory were far from resolved, this particular piece of land was protected, and the families there were somewhat more secure than they had been, which was not everything but was something real. The dressmaking business had become Fairchild and Garcia, when Rosa had formally become a partner rather than an employee, and had a reputation that extended well beyond Caldwell Creek. They had dressed the daughters of 3 territorial representatives for their weddings, which Lucia found enormously funny and Rosa found appropriately satisfying. Marshall's hair had begun to go gray at the temples, which Sadie found distinguished rather than aged, and she told him so, and he looked at her with the look he had given her since the early days of their marriage when she said something that landed in him somewhere deep, the look of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and has learned to accept it gratefully rather than questioning it. He still walked with her to the desert edge in the mornings when time allowed. Not every morning. Life had accumulated enough weight and responsibility that not every morning could be given to standing in the desert in the blue hour before the sun committed itself, but often enough that it remained theirs, that particular corner of the world where they had first stood together and said true things. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, a September morning when the desert was cooling from summer and the air had the first suggestion of the crisp that would deepen in October, they went together to the desert edge while both children were still asleep, carrying their coffee in the original tin cups, which were dented now and had been repaired once but were still the cups. They stood looking out at the saguaro and the sky going from pale to gold, at the hawks beginning their morning circles, at the landscape that had been strange to her and was now as known as her own hands. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she agreed. Do you remember what you said to me? On the morning you told me who you were. Tell me what I said, she said, because she wanted to hear it from him. You said you wanted to know me as yourself, he said, not as her. He paused. I have been thinking about that this morning, about how it must have felt to carry that, and how much I have always admired the courage it took to put it down. She looked at him. The morning light was hitting the side of his face and making him look almost exactly as he had looked on that morning, and she felt the decade between then and now as a physical weight of the good kind, the weight of something substantial built over time. I was afraid, she said. I thought you would send me away. I know, he said. I could see that, And I thought, if she is that afraid and still telling me, then she is the most honest person I have ever met. She looked at the desert. She thought about all the mornings, about Jacob learning to walk and Clara learning to talk, about the shop and the letters to the territorial government, and the wedding dress she had worn made by Lucia's hands, about the arguments and the agreements and the Sunday rides and the evenings on the porch, and the way he still, after 10 years, turned to face her fully when she spoke, the complete attention that had been the first remarkable thing about him. She thought about Clara as she thought about Clara every day, with a love that did not diminish and a grief that had become something she could carry without being broken by it. "I brought something," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and brought out a small folded piece of paper. He looked at it questioningly. "Clara's last letter," she said. "To you. She wrote it and never sent it. She was too ill. I found it in her things after. I have kept it." She held it out to him. "I think you should read it." He took it from her with careful hands. She watched him unfold it, smooth the worn paper against his palm. She had read it many times, knew the words. Clara's handwriting, the particular curves of it, the words written by a girl who was 20 years old and full of hope for a life in the desert with a man she had never met. She watched him read it. She watched his face. "Dear Mr. Archer," Clara had written, "I'm not feeling well today, but I wanted to write you something before I go to sleep, because reading your letters always makes me happy, and I want you to know that. You write about the hawk. I have been thinking about the hawk all week. I think I am going to love Arizona. I think I am going to love my life there. I am going to arrive wearing my best dress and my best hope, and I am very much looking forward to meeting you." When he looked up from the letter, his eyes were bright in the morning light. "She would have loved it here," he said. His voice was rough. "She would have," Sadie said. "She would have loved every bit of it." He folded the letter carefully, the same careful folds Clara had made, and held it for a moment before extending it back toward her. She shook her head. "Keep it," she said. "She wrote it for you." He put it in his chest pocket over his heart. They stood for a while in the quiet, and then Marshall Archer took Sadie Fairchild Archer's hand in his, her work-roughened, practical hand with its dressmaker's calluses, and held it the way he had held it for 10 years, with the particular grip of someone who intended to hold on. 10 more years, he said. "At least," she said. "At least," he agreed. The hawk appeared overhead, turning slow circles in the morning air the way hawks do, patient and absolute, and the desert went gold in every direction, and the creosote breathed around them, and somewhere back in town 2 children were waking up and the day was beginning. And the life they had built together from a telegram and a stagecoach and a lie told in grief and a truth told in courage was fully, completely, irrevocably theirs. Sadie Fairchild had arrived in Caldwell Creek wearing her sister's name and her own heartache, had found a man who looked at her and saw not the name she was carrying but the person behind it, and had discovered, in the slow, patient way of desert things, that being known completely was not the end of protection, but the beginning of it. She had brought Clara with her, in the name and the letters and the love and the small girl with dark eyes who laughed at beautiful things, and had been named for a girl who had known how to do that best. She stood in the desert morning, holding the hand of a man she loved with the full, honest, unambiguous weight of a person who had learned to be fully present, and she breathed in the creosote and the cool air, and the particular smell of the desert turning toward day, and she was at last completely home. Jacob's voice came across the morning air from the direction of town, calling for her, the word mama carrying in the clear desert air the way sound carries when there is nothing to stop it for miles. She turned toward it. "Coming," she called back. And beside her, Marshall Archer put on his hat against the rising sun, and they walked together back into the town that was theirs, through the morning that was theirs, into the life that was theirs and no one else's, carrying with them the whole of what they had been and the full brightness of what they were still becoming.